Good afternoon. My name is Francie Munoz from the Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to do a presentation about immigration law for temporary foreign workers. I'm very glad to be here with you today. So now let's get started. I'm going to share the screen with you. 1 second. Okay, the presentation will be about immigration law for temporary foreign workers. This is a disclaimer. Let me put this one here. Okay. This is a disclaimer. This presentation and video don't replace the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and any of these its regulations, and should not be used as a legal advice. It's just for general information only. Okay, temporary resident status. Temporary residents have temporary resident status. It means that they can stay in Canada temporarily. Who are temporary residents? Temporary residents are those people who come to Canada as a visitor with a visitor visa, workers with closed or open work permits, students with study permits, and temporary resident permits that are people to come to Canada, and the government gives that people who are inadmissible, but they can be a permit to be stay in Canada and enter and remain in Canada. Second slide. I don't know why this slide is not going. Okay. Temporary foreign workers. So temporary foreign workers are temporary residents that have temporary resident status in Canada. They are foreign workers. They are hired through the temporary foreign worker program to work in Canada, and they work for a limited period with a valid work permit. In Canada, there are ways to when the employer can hire the temporary foreign workers on the 4 streams. One is the seasonal agricultural worker program or SOP program. The other one is the agricultural stream. The other one is the stream for low wage positions. And the other one is the stream for high wage positions. Workers hired under the seasonal agricultural worker program. So they are hired under the bilateral agreement between Canada and Mexico or between the Canada and the Caribbean countries. Usually they come to Canada to work for a maximum period of 8 months. They start in January 1st and they finish in December 15th. They work a minimum of 240 hours of work within a period of time of 6 weeks or less. They work in activities related to FAR primary. FAR, 1 second, somebody wants to enter. Okay. They work in activities related to agricultural workers, the primary agriculture. And for the 2021 South season, the work permits for South program will indicate 9 months instead of 8 months in order to accommodate the workers during the quarantine period. Employers also need to submit the LMIA, the Labor Market Impasse Assessment, and the quarantine period is also considered work. The other stream is the workers hired under the agricultural stream. They are hired from any other countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Philippines, Colombia, Ecuador, etc., or by third-party representatives or recruiters. So they came with a recruiter from their countries. They come to Canada to work for a maximum period of 24 months, that means 2 years. They work for a minimum of 240 hours of work within a period of 6 weeks or less. They also work in activities related to on-farm primary agriculture. They also, the employer has to provide the LMIA for the workers before they came to Canada. Workers hired in low wage positions, that workers are workers with the rate wage offered is less than the provincial or territorial medium wage, and workers hired in high wage positions are workers where the wage rate is at or above the provincial territorial median wage. One second, there is something, there is a message here. Okay, I know the message. Please move this window. Okay. Second slide, work permits. In Canada, we have two types of work permits. We have an employer-specific work permit. It's also called closed work permits. They are specific permits that allow the workers to work accordingly to the conditions on the work permit. So workers can only work for a specific employer for a specific period of time, for a specific occupation, and for a specific location. There is a message there. Okay. You can, the workers who apply for a specific work permit or closed work permit, they cannot apply to extend the work permit under the SAU program. So if your employer may want to rehire you, you have to come back to your home country before you can apply for another work permit. Under the agricultural stream, you cannot apply for an extension. If you want to change jobs or change the employer, you have to apply again for a new work permit inside of Canada. To change employers, or also if you want to change the conditions of your work permit, is requirement that the employer must to give you a new offer of employment, a new LMII number, that means the labor market assessment impact number, and a new contract signed by you and for the future employer. Actually, recently, there is another option available. Is, one second, I'm going to let somebody enter. Okay. There is another option available recently, like what I mentioned to you, is extend the participation or change the international experience IMC work permit. If they could you please turn on your mics? Somebody is talking.
No.
Okay. Okay, what I mentioned again, there is another option, is to change the International Experience Canada Work Permit if you have been working for the same employer at the same location and your job duties, they are not going to change. Let me see. I don't know what is happening with this. Okay, now open work permits. Open work permits allow workers to work for any employer in Canada. There is one program, is the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers, but I'm going to talk about it later. Generally, people who obtain this kind of permits have some other type of status in Canada, like for example, they are protected persons, or they are first stage approval on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, or they are refugee claimants, or permanent residents, or citizens. With an open work permit, you can extend your work permit. Also, you can change the conditions of your work permit anytime. And this work permit doesn't confer the temporary resident status. It's just a permit. Restoration of temporary resident status. If a temporary resident has lost their status or later authorization to work of study expired, they may apply to restore the status. There is something called implied status. Implied status is 90 days. You have 90 days from the day you lose your temporary resident status to apply for restoration. The worker has to meet the initial requirements for the state. That means if he had an initial study permit, he has to apply for another study permit, not for a work permit. Also, restoration of status is when your application extends your status if your status was refused. If you file an application and your status was refused, you have 90 days for apply to restore the status and attach or add any missing document or new documentation that you didn't provide before. You had implied status if you apply to extend it before it's expired up and until the decision or your application will be made. Okay, now the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers. This is a new program. This program allows migrant workers in Canada who are experiencing abuse or who are at risk of abuse in the context of their employment in Canada and may be eligible to receive an Open Work Permit that is exempt from the labor market impasse assessment process or the LMII. To be eligible for this kind of program, the worker must be in a status. That means he has to have a valid open work permit at the time when he wants to apply. He has to had a valid closed work permit that is exempted of LAMIA or be authorized to work without a work permit under the implied status that I mentioned before. This kind of application is free, no fee to apply. The length of the permit is up to the officer, so usually it's a period of 1 year. Also, I'm going to tell you about this program, the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers program. What kind of things are considered abuse? Abuse can be physical abuse, including assault and forcible confinement, sexual abuse, including sexual contact without consent, psychological abuse, including threats and intimidation, or financial abuse, including fraud and extortion and not paying wage owed by the employer to the worker, or stealing or taking the worker's salary, money, checks, or coercing them into giving them up. There are another examples of abuse, of risks of abuse. For example, the employer or the recruiter or both have coerced the migrant worker into paying job placement and recruitment fees, or for example, the employer repeatedly is repeatedly not paying the wages that the worker are allowed to get. For example, the migrant worker is repeatedly harassed by a co-worker, or he experienced unwanted physical or verbal behavior that is offending or humiliating the worker. Sorry. Also, another example of abuse can be when the migrant worker is threatened by the employer if the worker complain or if the worker asks about their work conditions or their rights. Also is abuse when the employer forcing or pressuring the migrant worker to perform a work that is not in the work permit, that contravenes the condition of the work permit. For example, when the employer say just work in another farm or work, do different activities or work in different location. So this is considered a form or coerced engagement in an illegal activity and may be accompanied by or enable further threats, intimidation, or abuse. Another example of abuse is, for example, insulting the worker, intimidating, humiliating, harassing the worker, threatening the worker, name calling the worker, yelling at the worker, blaming the worker, shaming the worker, ridiculing, disrespecting, or criticizing the worker. That include, for example, with respect to the immigration status or deportation. So the threatening about the deportation, I'm going to deport you if you didn't do something. This is another way of example of abuse. Also, there is abuse when the migrant worker cannot be directly experience abuse, but the migrant worker can notice that there are some other co-workers that are being abused by the employer, and also this is putting on risk in abuse situation the worker. There are also another more forms of abuse in the context of COVID-19. They are related to working and living conditions of the migrant workers. Somebody entered to the meeting. That's okay. Okay. What I mentioned to you is there are another forms of abuse in the context of COVID-19. But these are related to the working conditions and the living conditions. For example, when during the COVID, for example, the employer doesn't provide the wages that are owed to the worker during the mandatory quarantine or isolation period upon the entry to Canada. For example, when the migrant worker is forced or pressured to perform work that violate the conditions of the mandatory requirement, isolation period or quarantine, or the worker is forced to work when the worker is showing symptoms of COVID-19 or is forced to work with co-workers with should be in quarantine or who are symptomatic. Also, it's abuse when a migrant worker is prevented from seeking medical assistance, on when the employer didn't provide the adequate tools and working conditions implemented by the public health and social distancing protocols implemented. Also, it's abuse the reprisals actions against a worker for example, taking sick leave or refusing to work in unsafe working conditions. It's also abuse when the employer doesn't provide appropriate and adequate accommodation in the workplace for quarantine. For example, isolate the workers in order to prevent the virus spread, or failing to provide the workers with cleaning products or prevent the spreading shared accommodations, for example. It's also abuse when employers prevent the worker from obtaining essential items during the quarantine or isolation period. For example, the employer doesn't allow the worker to go to buy groceries or medication, or fails to provide inadequate alternate arrangements, for example, pick up or deliveries or something like that. Yeah. Okay. Second slide. Okay. For this kind of open work permit for vulnerable workers, you can apply directly to the Immigration, Refugee and Citizen Canada IRCC for an open work permit for vulnerable workers by filing out the application online. So with the application online, you have to attach supporting evidence of the abuse. For example, what kind of supporting evidence? You can, for example, attach a description of the abuse, of risk of abuse faced by the migrant worker, like a declaration of facts, a letter, a statement or report from an abuse supporting organization like the medical doctor or the healthcare professional or other such entity. Also, you can attach to support this kind of application a sworn statement that's been an affidavit by the applicant. You also can file a copy of an official complaint form filed with any enforcement agency, for example, a police report or a Canada Border Service Agency report. Also, you can put a copy of an official complaint completed by the migrant worker and submitted to any provincial enforcement agency. For example, the worker filed an application to the Employment Standards Branch of Human Rights Tribunal. Also, the employer has to support the application with additional materials, like, for example, victims' impact statements, hard copies of email messages, photos showing injuries or working conditions, or witness testimonies also. Okay, there is another kind of application is the temporary resident permits for victims of human trafficking. For purpose of issuing this kind of temporary resident permit for victims of human trafficking, the purpose is to respond to the vulnerable situation sorry, of the victims of human trafficking, and providing that kind of legalization of the status of the temporary resident in Canada when appropriate. These applicants can apply for a temporary resident permit up to 180 days. That means 6 months or more. The fees for this application is $200 plus the work permit is $155. And there are exempts of the payment application fees for the initial short 180 days. And after that, the subsequent more than 180 days are not exempt of the fee. Workers can apply for a work permit if they apply for the temporary resident permit for victims of human trafficking. Now I'm going to tell you about the permanent resident pathways or programs to temporary foreign workers. So workers that pretend or have the intention to apply for a permanent resident, they have limited pathways, but they have some. So they have the in Canada application for permanent resident on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. They have the option of family sponsorship, refugee claims, Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, the OIMP, and the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot. I'm going to talk you about that. So the in Canada application for permanent resident on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. Humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications is an application to people with exceptional cases or exceptional circumstances. So the immigration officer assess these applications on case-by-case basis, and they can check very well and look at the factors, different kind of factors. What kind of factors they are going to check? For example, how settled the person is in Canada, the general family ties to Canada, the establishment in Canada, the unusual and undeserved or disproportionate hardship, the best interest of any children involved, and what could happen to the worker if they don't grant the request. So there are factors specific that they have to be considered in order to approve a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. This a little bit expensive. The processing fee is $550 plus the right of a permanent resident fee is $500. Is a total of $1,050 for the applicant. And if you want to include your spouse, also you have to pay the other extra $1,050 for the processing fee. But if you have the option to pay the right of permanent resident at the beginning or later during the process. If you want to include a dependent child, you have to pay $150 for each child that you can attach to the application. This is a paper-based application, so you have to complete a lot of immigration forms and submit to the address that is provided by the website, immigration website. We have the family sponsorship. If you are, for example, in a romantic relationship with a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, and you are married or have lived together with that Canadian citizen or permanent resident for at least 1 year, your spouse may be able to sponsor you and also sponsor your dependent children for permanent resident. This is also an application on paper, and if you need assistance, our legal clinic can assist you with the application. Refugee claims. Refugee claims. Refugees are people who are fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution, so they are not able to return home. In Canada, there are 2 Canadian refugee protection programs. One is the Refugee and Humanitarian Resettlement Program for people who need protection from outside Canada. And there is another one is the in Canada Asylum Program for people making refugee protection claims from within Canada. So one is from outside Canada and the other one is within Canada. The refugees who wants to apply for this application has to demonstrate that your fear of returning must be based on your race or religion or political opinion or nationality, or because you are being part of a social group, or such as women or people on a particular sexual orientation. You also has to show that there is no protection for you in your country, that there is nowhere in your country that will be safe for you. There is not any place in the whole country when you don't feel safe to stay. When you make a refugee claim, a removal order is going to made against you. So the removal order will only be enforced if you lose your refugee claim. If you lose your refugee claim and you are sent back to your home country, believe me, it's very, very extremely difficult for you to return to Canada again. This is a very risk. There is another program, is the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, the OIMP. Is calling, there are many categories to apply for the Ontario Nominee Program. We have for the migrant workers, the in-demand skills stream allows, that allow to the migrant workers to apply for this kind of program. It's usually for workers that are in agriculture, construction, trucking, or there are personal support workers, and they want to apply for a permanent resident. The employer has to provide any support for this application. So the employer is supported, is involved, is part of the application process. He has to fill out forms. He has to meet many requirements. They must provide certain documents to complete the application and meet certain requirements in order to the worker be eligible for this kind of application. For example, the employer must have been in business at least 3 years, earn revenue of at least $500,000 outside of the GTA region, and have at least 3 full-time employees who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents. This is requirements for the employer to be supporting the application. Also, in this program, you must have a job offer that is full-time, that is permanent, and be in one of the occupations described in the National Occupational Classification NOC in skill level C or D. The NOC is the classification of different occupations in Canada, so you have to have a NOC skill level C or D. Also, you must have at least 9 months of full-time or also the equivalent in part-time of paid work experience in Ontario in the same in-demand occupations with the same NOC code and as in your initial job offer. Also, you must have gained this work experience within the 3 years prior to submitting your application while legally living and working in Ontario. There is another requirement for this application. You have to be able to understand and read and write and speak in English or in French at the Canadian language benchmark level 4 of higher. So you need to know the 4 categories of the language in order to pass the exam and get more than level 4. To prove that you have the mandatory language skills, you must take an approved English or French language test before you submit your application to this stream. So you have to take the IELTS or the CELPID or the TOEFL, whatever you want to take in order to pass and get the score superior or higher of level 4. You must have also a Canadian secondary school from your country, high school, diploma or credential that is equivalent in another country, and you have to complete, you have completed that studies outside of Canada, so you need to get an educational credential assessment. The name is the ECA. You have to get the ECA assessment that proves that your education is equivalent to a Canadian high school diploma in Canada. There is another important program available for migrant workers for permanent resident is the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot Program. This is a program that started in May 15, 2020. It was the last year and is going to be available only for 3 years. And for this program, also you have to meet similar requirements to the immigration nominee program. So the requirements are, you must be able to be fluent in the 4 categories of language, in English or French at the Canadian language bar, also with a level 4 or higher. You have to understand, read, write, and speak the language in English or French. You must take an approved English or French language test before you submit your application in the places that are offering, official places that are offering this kind of test, regulated. You must have a Canadian secondary school, high school diploma or credential that is, or its equivalent in another country. And that education has to be evaluated and you have to get an educational credential assessment, ECA also. For the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot Program, also you have to have a job offer full-time, no seasonal work in any eligible industry and occupation in Canada that are specific for this kind of programs. What are the eligible industries? For example, for this kind of program, only the industries that are eligible for apply to this program are the meat product manufacturing, if the worker work in a greenhouse or in nursery and floriculture production that include mushrooms production, animal production, and it's not included the aquaculture. So this is the specific industries. These are the specific industries when the worker has to be worker under the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot Program. Also has to be in an eligible occupation in Canada. So what I mentioned to you, the occupations in Canada are classified by the National Occupational Classification NOC. So the work that the worker is doing and is trying to do, it has to be part of the NOC occupations. Also, the worker has to have at least 12 months of full-time, non-seasonal Canadian work experience in the program in the eligible industries and occupations that I mentioned before. The worker also has to have enough money to support himself and the dependents, family members, when he wants to settle in Canada. These are the resources. These are the resources that you can see. This is a list of resources available for migrant workers. So if you want to get information or need assistance or something, you can contact any of these resources, or you can contact our legal clinic office in the phone numbers that appears here, 519-253-3526, extension 4033, or by WhatsApp at 226-935-7772. Thank you so much. So let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. Merci. Questions?
Yes, hi, Francie. I have a question. And it's more if you could please clarify to me about the non-seasonal work industry for the agri-food program. I don't know if I'm understood right, but you say if they work in a like greenhouse or like a garden center, they could not apply if that's the case.
For the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot Program, this is like a recognition of that the government is going to give into a specific industries or workers that have been working for a long time in that kind of jobs or occupations. So the government restricted the occupations and industries in order to apply for this kind of program. So if the worker work in the past in a manufacturing that is producing meat, or is in a greenhouse in a harvesting inside in an invernadero, or is a nursery and floriculture production, and has been working in a mushroom greenhouse, or in animal production, like for example, helping with the rise of lambs or cows or piggies or something like that. So this is the program that is allowed for them to apply for permanent residence. They are very specific. Yeah, so if the worker is, for example, packeting, or is working outside the greenhouse, or is working with fish or something like that, they cannot apply for this program because the industries are very specific.
Thank you. And also, where can I find, there is a specific place that I can find for these specific industries that they can apply or that they will be like falling into this classification? Just to
Yeah,
make sure that there is a place that they can see which industries are those.
yes, for sure. Yes, the website of the IRCC Canada, they have that means if you look for the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot Program, you can find a link to go to the eligible industries and the eligible occupation specific for this program. So you can find if somebody is working in a meat product manufacturing, how kind of activities are part of this kind of job. So there are descriptions of the works and the activities into the website. So you can find in the IRCC or the www.canada.ca. Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. More questions?
I have more questions, but I don't want to take everybody's turn. So if somebody else has questions, I'll wait after them.
Go ahead, Aswani. I think there are no more questions.
Okay. My other question is about, I have heard that there is well, no, sorry, I saw in your slides that they can be sponsored through family. So if they have family here, who this family can sponsor, or how can that be that sponsorship?
So if the worker get married with a citizen, Canadian citizen, or a permanent resident, or have lived together for at least 1 year, that Canadian or permanent resident can sponsor the worker and the dependent children they have for permanent residence. So it's a regular application for a sponsor, a family sponsorship. So are the same requirements for everybody else that is applying for a family sponsorship. So the sponsor has to file and have to complete many application forms, and also the applicant has to the applicant, I'm talking about the sponsored person, he has to fill out another bunch of package of forms, complete the forms, submit the supporting documents that are applicable for this kind of application, and the checklist, complete the checklist, and make sure that everything is included before to submit the application. This application is on paper. So you have to submit everything in a big envelope to the address that the immigration officer has designated to this kind of application. So if there is something that is missing or is incomplete, the application, the immigration officer is going to send back the complete package and you have to start again.
Okay, so but it's not extended family, it's just partnerships. Like it's like, for example, if I'm here and I want to apply for my family, can I apply for some of my family and sponsor them?
It's only for partners of migrant workers. So the migrant worker, because has a temporary resident status, they are not allowed to apply to sponsor any members of the families to Canada. So the only way to be permanent resident is through the family sponsorship if they are married or if they are living together with a Canadian citizen or permanent resident spouse here for at least 1 year.
So in the instance that they have kids and they bring their kids here for education, so I have heard that the government has this program for people that come to study here in Canada and they can apply for resident permanent. Will that be another way? Can they like be then sponsored from their own kids and they can bring and pay for education for their kids?
It could be, but the situation on most of temporary foreign workers are not a good situation. They are usually they live in countries that the countries they didn't provide the good quality of life. So they don't have the money to bring the children to study in Canada. So studying in Canada is a little bit expensive. It's not very, what I want to say is very expensive. So most of the workers cannot afford their children to study here in Canada. So it's very expensive. Even for that reason, most of migrant workers, they even have the option to bring any of the children's. But if, for example, the mother, that means if the migrant worker get married here with a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and the spouse has a baby, and the baby obviously is Canadian baby, so the children or the kids they have, they can study here in Canada without any problem. But if, for example, the migrant worker is a woman and gets be pregnant here in Canada. So what happened with the baby is if the baby was born in Canada, depending of the mother. So if the mother doesn't have a status differently, a permanent resident, if she has the temporary resident status, she has to come back to her country with the baby. So it's not easy. It's not easy for migrant workers because the conditions where the conditions in their countries and the conditions here. It's just a temporary status, and the temporary status give him many rights as the other permanent residents.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Sure.
And you mentioned you have a application WhatsApp, right?
An application, sorry,
WhatsApp application.
WhatsApp.
Yeah, WhatsApp.
The WhatsApp is the telephone number that we are that we had available for migrant workers in order to get our services, legal services. So if you need assistance, if the worker need assistance to file an application for any of the programs that I mentioned here, you can contact us and we can help you if you meet the requirements to be eligible for our services. So that means the Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic provide legal services to people with low income according to the financial eligibility chart. So if you meet the requirements, we can assist you with any of these applications.
Okay.
So could you also refer services if we don't live in Windsor, Essex?
Yes, I put in the list many resources for migrant workers available for them. So they are even in Windsor and others are not in Windsor and in Toronto or any other place of Canada. So you can reach them, but if you are talking specifically about the legal services from the clinics, legal clinics in Ontario. So we had the same legal clinic in different locations. So there is a Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic in Windsor, but you can find another legal clinic in Chatham, in Kisville, in London, in Mississauga, in Sarnia. Yes, in Sarnia, I think it's the same. Is Kitchener or Sarnia, something like that. I don't have the list here, but for sure we had a legal clinic close to Sarnia.
And you could like refer us to that information.
Yes, so if you need assistance, you can go there and you can ask for assistance, legal assistance in the immigration matters, or also you can contact the other community legal services.
Excuse me. My question is, how many language did you help with the people? Like, did you have some translate the people who speak no French and no English?
We offer the services in our legal clinic in English, in French, in Spanish, but also we had many people from the other countries with different kind of languages for free, and we can just assist any people that is going to ask the clinic for legal assistance in a regular basis. We had interpretation to provide the assistance for the workers. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this presentation is very useful. Contact us if you need our assistance, if you need an advice, if you need legal representation. We can help you anytime. So thank you so much to stay today with us.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really good. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome and have a very good day. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.